Sometimes survival depends on trusting a stranger. What began as a desperate escape through the Wyoming wilderness became a journey that would challenge everything one young woman believed about family, loyalty, and the lengths people will go to protect those they love. This isn't just about finding shelter from a storm, it's about discovering that home isn't always where you're born, but where someone finally sees you for who you truly are. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The November wind cut through the Colorado mountains like a blade, carrying with it the promise of the season's first major snowstorm. Elena Vasquez pressed her face against the passenger window of the Greyhound bus, watching the landscape transform. From rolling plains into jagged peaks crowned with early snow. Her breath fogged the glass as she traced patterns with her fingertip, a nervous habit she'd carried since childhood. At 22, Elena had learned to travel light. Everything she owned fit into a single duffel bag tucked beneath her feet. 3 changes of clothes, a worn paperback novel, her grandmother's rosary, and exactly $47 in crumpled bills. The bus ticket to Millbrook had cost $35, leaving her with barely enough for a meal, let alone a place to stay once she arrived. She pulled her grandmother's letter from her jacket pocket for the 100th time. The paper soft, from repeated folding. Written in Spanish in her abuela's careful script, it contained an address and a simple message. Mija, if you ever need to disappear, go here. Ask for Thomas Brennan. Tell him Maria Vasquez sent you. He will understand. Elena had never heard her grandmother mention anyone named Thomas Brennan, but then again, her abuela had been full of secrets. Growing up in the cramped apartment in East Los Angeles, Elena had often caught her grandmother staring out the window with a faraway look, as if remembering another life entirely. When pressed about her past, Maria would only say she'd lived in many places before settling in California, and that not all stories were meant for young ears. The bus shuddered to a stop at a roadside diner, the driver announcing a 20-minute break. Elena remained in her seat, conserving her energy and her remaining money. Through the window, she watched other passengers stretch their legs and disappear into the warmth of the diner. The smell of coffee and fried food drifted through the open door, making her stomach clench with hunger. She'd been traveling for 18 hours, having left Los Angeles in the middle of the night. The decision to run hadn't been easy, but staying would have been deadly. Marcus Delgado's threats had escalated beyond mere intimidation. When she'd witnessed him and his crew beating a shopkeeper who'd refused to pay protection money, Eleanor knew she'd seen too much. The look in Marcus's eyes when he'd spotted her across the street had told her everything she needed to know. She was now a liability. Elena had worked for Marcus's cleaning service for 8 months, grateful for steady employment that paid cash, and didn't ask too many questions about documentation. She'd thought she was just scrubbing offices and emptying trash cans. Only gradually had she realized the cleaning service was a front, and that many of the buildings she worked in housed operations that had nothing to do with legitimate business. The discovery had been accidental. Working late one evening at a warehouse Marcus claimed stored restaurant supplies, Elena had found herself trapped in a storage closet when voices echoed through the building. Through a crack in the door, she'd watched men count stacks of money and package what were clearly drugs. Marcus had been there, directing the operation with the calm efficiency of someone who'd done this many times before. She'd tried to quit the next day, claiming she'd found another job. But Marcus wasn't the kind of man who let people simply walk away, especially not people who might have seen things they shouldn't have. His first warning had been subtle, a comment about how dangerous the neighborhoods could be for a young woman living alone. The second had been less subtle. Her apartment had been broken into, though nothing was stolen. The message was clear. DEC. Final straw had come 3 days ago when she'd returned home to find Marcus waiting in her apartment. He'd been sitting at her kitchen table, flipping through her mail with casual interest. The violation of her space, the implicit threat in his presence, had crystallized her decision. She'd packed her bag that night and left before dawn, taking nothing that might tie her to Los Angeles. Now, as the bus pulled back onto the highway and began its final approach to Millbrook, Eleanor felt the familiar mixture of fear and hope that had sustained her through the journey. The mountains rose around them like ancient guardians, their peaks disappearing into low-hanging clouds. Snow began to fall, light at first, then with increasing intensity. Millbrook appeared suddenly around a bend in the road, a cluster of buildings nestled in a valley between towering peaks. The town looked like something from a postcard. White, church steeple, main street lined with Victorian storefronts, warm light spilling from windows into the gathering dusk. It was the kind of place Elena had seen in movies but never imagined herself living in. The bus depot turned out to be little, more than a bench outside a gas station. As Elena stepped off the bus, the cold hit her like a physical blow. Her Los Angeles clothing, thin jeans, canvas sneakers, a denim jacket, offered little protection against the mountain air. The few other passengers quickly disappeared into waiting cars, leaving her alone on the sidewalk, with snow beginning to accumulate on her shoulders. She approached the gas station attendant, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, who was watching the storm with obvious concern. "Excuse me," Elena said, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I'm looking for someone named Thomas Brennan. Do you know where I might find him?" The woman's expression changed subtly, becoming more guarded. "Thomas Brennan?" she repeated, studying Eleanor's face carefully. "You're not from around here." "No, ma'am. I'm from California. My grandmother gave me his name before she passed. She said if I ever needed help." The woman nodded slowly, understanding passing between them without need for details. "Thomas lives about 6 miles out of town, up Canyon Road. But honey, you can't walk there in this weather. The storm's getting worse, and that road's treacherous, even in good conditions." Elena felt her heart sink. She couldn't afford a taxi, even if one was available in a town this small. "Is there maybe a bus that goes that direction?" The woman shook her head sympathetically. "Last bus runs at 5, and that was 2 hours ago. Look, why don't you come inside and warm up? Maybe we can figure something out." The gas station's interior felt like heaven after the biting cold outside. Elena stood by the coffee machine, letting the warmth seep into her bones while the attendant made some phone calls. Through the window, she watched the snow fall with increasing intensity, already coating the ground in a pristine white blanket. "I called around," the woman said, hanging up the phone. "Most folks are already hunkered down for the storm, but Jake Morrison might be willing to give you a ride. He's got a truck that can handle the mountain roads." Elena felt a surge of gratitude. That would be amazing. How much would he charge? "Oh, honey, Jake doesn't take money for helping people. That's just not how we do things up here. But I should warn you, he's a bit rough around the edges. Don't let his appearance scare you." 20 minutes later, a battered pickup truck pulled up outside the station. The man who emerged looked like he'd stepped out of a different era entirely. Thomas Jake Morrison stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to fill, doorways and hands that looked like they could bend steel. His dark hair was streaked with premature grey, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his face. Despite the cold, he wore only a flannel shirt over jeans and work boots. "You the one looking for Thomas Brennan?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. Elena nodded, suddenly feeling very small. "Yes, sir. I'm Elena." Jake studied her for a long moment, taking in her inadequate clothing and the single bag at her feet. You picked a hell of a night to come calling. Get in the truck before you freeze to death. The pickup's interior was warm and smelled of leather and pine. Jake drove with the easy confidence of someone who'd navigated these roads countless times, the truck's headlights cutting through the swirling snow. The windshield wipers worked overtime to keep the glass clear. "So what's your business with Thomas?" Jake asked, after several minutes of silence. Elena hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "My grandmother knew him. She said he might be able to help me with some difficulties I'm having." Jake glanced at her sideways. "Your grandmother have a name?" "Maria Vasquez." The truck nearly went off the road. Jake yanked the wheel hard to the right, pulling them back onto the pavement with a curse. He pulled over to the shoulder and sat there for a moment, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles went white. "Maria Vasquez," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Jesus Christ. Elena felt alarm bells going off in her head. "Did you know her?" Jake turned to look at her fully for the first time, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "What did she tell you about Thomas Brennan?" "Just that if I ever needed help, I should find him, that he would understand." Jake was quiet for a long time, the truck's engine idling as snow continued to fall around them. Finally, he put the truck back in drive and pulled onto the road. "Thomas Brennan is dead," he said quietly. "Has been 3 years now." Elena felt the bottom drop out of her world. Her grandmother's final safety net, the one person who was supposed to help her start over, was gone. She was stranded in a mountain town with no money, no connections, and nowhere to go. "But Maria was right about one thing," Jake continued, his voice gentle now. "I do understand. Thomas was my grandfather, and if Maria Vasquez sent you to him, then you're safe now. We'll figure this out." The relief that washed over Elena was so intense it brought tears to her eyes. She wiped them away quickly, not wanting to appear weak, but Jake had already noticed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "It's okay," he said softly. "Whatever you're running from, it can't reach you here. These mountains protect their own." They drove the rest of the way in comfortable silence, the truck climbing steadily through increasingly treacherous terrain. The road wound through dense forests of pine and aspen, the trees heavy with snow and bending under the weight. Several times, Jake had to navigate around fallen branches or patches of ice, but the truck handled the conditions with ease. Finally, they turned onto a narrow dirt road barely visible through the snow. Jake's headlights illuminated a wooden sign so weathered the words were barely legible: "Brennan Ranch, private property." The road climbed for another mile before opening into a small valley sheltered by peaks on 3 sides. Through the falling snow, Elena could make out the silhouettes of several buildings, a large farmhouse, a massive barn, and what looked like a workshop or garage. Warm light spilled from the farmhouse windows, and smoke rose from the chimney, quickly dispersed by the wind. Jake parked near the front porch and turned off the engine. "Welcome to Brennan Ranch," he said. "It's not much, but it's home." Elena gathered her bag and followed Jake through the snow to the front door. The porch, wrapped around the entire house, with chairs and a swing that spoke of lazy summer evenings. Jake stomped the snow off his boots before opening the door, releasing a wave of warmth and the smell of wood smoke and something delicious cooking. The farmhouse interior was exactly what Elena had imagined a mountain home would be. Exposed. Wooden beams, stone fireplace with a crackling fire, comfortable furniture that looked like it had been chosen for function rather than fashion. Photographs covered the mantelpiece and walls, showing generations of people against the backdrop of the same mountains she'd just traveled through. "Lucy," Jake called out, "we've got company." A woman emerged from what Elena assumed was the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron. She was probably in her 50s, with silver-streaked brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the kind of genuine smile that immediately put people at ease. "Well, hello there," she said, looking at Elena with curiosity rather than suspicion. "I'm Lucy Morrison, Jake's wife, and you look absolutely frozen, you poor thing." "This is Elena," Jake said, hanging his coat on a peg by the door. "Maria Vasquez's granddaughter." The effect of those words was immediate and dramatic. Lucy's hand flew to her chest, and she staggered slightly as if she'd been struck. Jake moved quickly to steady her, concern creasing his features. "Lucy, you okay?" Lucy stared at Elena as if seeing a ghost. "Maria's granddaughter," she whispered. "After all these years. Jake, she has her eyes. The same eyes." Elena felt increasingly confused and somewhat alarmed by the reactions her grandmother's name was producing. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand. How did you know my grandmother?" Lucy and Jake exchanged a long look, some complex communication passing between them that Elena couldn't interpret. Finally, Lucy seemed to come to a decision. "Sit down, honey," she said gently, guiding Elena to the sofa near the fireplace. "There's a lot you don't know about your grandmother. She never told you about her life before Los Angeles." Elena sank into the cushions, grateful for the warmth of the fire on her back. "She always said the past was better left buried." "Sometimes it is," Jake agreed, settling into an armchair across from her. "But sometimes the past has a way of finding us anyway. Your grandmother lived here for almost 10 years. She was family." The word hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning Elena didn't yet understand. Lucy disappeared into the kitchen, returning with a steaming mug of hot chocolate topped with marshmallows. "Drink this," she said firmly. "You need to get warm before we go any further." Elena wrapped her hands around the mug, letting the heat penetrate her frozen fingers. The hot chocolate was the best thing she'd tasted in days, rich and sweet with a hint of cinnamon. As she sipped, she felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. "Your grandmother came here in 1982, Lucy began, settling onto the sofa beside Elena. "She was pregnant, alone, and running from something she never talked about. Thomas Brennan took her in, gave her work, gave her a place to belong. She lived in the small cabin behind the main house until her daughter was born." Elena nearly choked on her hot chocolate. "Daughter. My grandmother never mentioned having another daughter." "Your mother's sister," Jake said quietly. "Born here in this house." On a December night much like this one, Maria named her Isabella. The room seemed to spin around Elena. She set down the mug with shaking hands, her mind reeling with the implications. "I have an aunt. Where is she?" Lucy's expression grew sad. "Isabella died when she was 16. It was an accident. She was climbing in the mountains and fell. Maria was, well, she was never quite the same after that. She left about a month later, said she couldn't bear to stay where everything reminded her of Isabella." Elena felt tears burning her eyes. Her grandmother had lost a daughter and never spoken of it, had carried that grief in silence for decades. It explained so much about the sadness Elena had sometimes glimpsed in her abuela's eyes, the way she would hold Elena extra tight sometimes, as if afraid she might disappear. "She never came back," Jake continued. "But she wrote letters. Not often, but enough to let us know she was okay. The last one came about 5 years ago. She mentioned you, said you were the light of her life, that you reminded her so much of Isabella." Elena wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "She died 6 months ago. Cancer. She made me promise to be strong, to take care of myself. I tried, but life got complicated," Lucy finished gently. "It has a way of doing that." Elena nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. The warmth of the fire, the kindness of these strangers who weren't really strangers, and the emotional revelation about her family was overwhelming. She felt like she might break apart from the sheer weight of it all. Jake leaned forward in his chair. "Your grandmother's letter to you. Do you still have it?" Eleanor retrieved the letter from her pocket and handed it to him. Jake read it carefully, his expression growing more thoughtful with each line. When he finished, he passed it to Lucy, who read it with equal attention. "She knew," Lucy said finally. "Somehow, she knew you might need us someday. The cabin where your grandmother lived is still there," Jake added. "We've kept it maintained, used it for storage mostly, but it could be cleaned up, made livable again. If you need a place to stay while you figure things out." Elena stared at them in disbelief. "You would do that? For me? But you don't even know me." "We know enough," Lucy said firmly. "You're Maria's granddaughter. That makes you family. And family takes care of family no matter what." The simple acceptance in her voice broke something loose in Elena's chest. For the first time in months, she felt truly safe. Not just physically safe, but emotionally safe in a way she hadn't experienced since her grandmother's death. "I should warn you," Elena said, feeling they deserved honesty. "I'm not just here because I wanted a change of scenery. I'm running from some dangerous people. I witnessed something I shouldn't have, and they've made it clear I'm not safe in Los Angeles." Jake's expression hardened. "What kind of dangerous people?" Elena told them about Marcus, about the cleaning service and what she'd discovered, about the escalating threats and her decision to run. Jake listened without interruption, his face growing increasingly grim. "You did the right thing leaving," he said when she finished. "And you're safe here. People like that don't venture into these mountains, especially not in winter. They're urban predators. They need their familiar territory to operate." Lucy stood up suddenly. "I'm making up the guest room for tonight. Tomorrow we'll go look at the cabin, see what it needs. But right now you need food and sleep. You look like you haven't had a proper meal in days." Elena realized with a start that Lucy was right. She'd been surviving on vending machine snacks and gas station coffee since leaving Los Angeles. "I should probably mention, I don't have much money. I can pay for room and board, but not much." "We'll figure that out later," Jake said dismissively. "Right now, the only thing that matters is getting you settled." As Lucy bustled around preparing dinner, Elena found herself drawn to the photographs on the mantelpiece. Most showed the same. Family through different generations, children growing up, couples aging together, celebrations and everyday moments captured in time. But one photograph made her stop cold. It showed a young woman who looked so much like Elena, it could have been her twin. The woman was standing in front of the very cabin Jake had mentioned, holding a baby and smiling at the camera. Even across the decades, Elena could see her grandmother's features in the woman's face. "That's Isabella," Jake said softly, appearing beside her. "She was about your age when that was taken. The baby is her son, your cousin David. He moved to Denver after high school, works as an engineer now, married with kids of his own." Elena stared at the photograph, seeing not just resemblance but connection. This was her family, these people she'd never known existed. Her grandmother had roots here, had been loved here, had lost here, and now Elena was standing in the same place, being offered the same acceptance and belonging. "Does David know about me?" she asked. "No, but he will soon. He comes up for Christmas every year, brings the whole family. You'll like him. He has Isabella's adventurous spirit, but with enough common sense to stay away from dangerous cliff faces." Dinner was a revelation. Lucy had prepared what she called mountain comfort food, pot roast so tender it fell apart at the touch of a fork, roasted vegetables from their own garden, homemade bread still warm from the oven. Elena ate until she was uncomfortably full, her body desperate to make up for days of inadequate nutrition. As they ate, Jake and Lucy shared stories about Eleanor's grandmother and Isabella, painting a picture of life on the ranch that was both idyllic and challenging. They told her about Maria's skill with healing herbs, about Isabella's love of horses and mountains, about the community of neighbors who looked out for each other across the vast distances of rural Colorado. Your grandmother was the one who taught me to garden, Lucy said, clearing away the dinner plates. I couldn't grow weeds when I first married Jake. Maria showed me how to read the soil, how to know what plants needed just by looking at them. I still use her methods. The mention of her grandmother's gardening brought back a flood of memories. Elena remembered spending hours with her abuela in the tiny plot behind their Los Angeles apartment building, learning the names of plants and how to coax vegetables from stubborn urban soil. Her grandmother had always seemed to possess an almost mystical understanding of growing things. After dinner, they sat by the fire while the storm raged outside. The wind howled around the house, rattling windows and sending occasional puffs of smoke back down the chimney. But inside, all was warmth and peace. Elena felt herself relaxing for the first time in months, the constant tension she'd carried beginning to ease. The storm should blow itself out by morning, Jake said, adding, another log to the fire. We'll go look at the cabin then, see what needs to be done to make it comfortable. Elena nodded, though part of her was reluctant to leave this warm sanctuary. The guest room Lucy had prepared would be luxury compared to the cramped bus seat she'd occupied for the previous 2 days, but there was something magical about this moment by the fire, surrounded by the evidence of a family she'd never known existed. As if reading her thoughts, Lucy reached over and squeezed her hand. This is your home now, Elena, for as long as you need it to be. Your grandmother found sanctuary here, and so will you. Outside, the wind seemed to be picking up even more intensity, and Eleanor found herself wondering about the small cabin that might become her new home. What would it be like to wake up surrounded by mountains instead of traffic noise? To have space to breathe, to think, to figure out who she wanted to become now that she was free from the constraints of her old life? The questions would have to wait for morning. For now, it was enough to be warm, safe, and surrounded by people who had welcomed her not as a stranger, but as family returning home. Elena woke to absolute silence. After months of sleeping to the soundtrack of Los Angeles traffic, the mountain quiet felt almost unnatural. Pale morning light filtered through frost-covered windows, creating intricate patterns of ice crystals that sparkled like diamonds. She lay still for several minutes, allowing herself to absorb the reality that she was safe, warm, and welcome. The guest room was simple but comfortable, with handmade quilts and furniture that spoke of generations of careful craftsmanship. A water pitcher and basin sat on an antique dresser, and Elena realized with a start that this was probably the same room her grandmother had stayed in 30 years ago when she first arrived, pregnant and afraid. Voices drifted up from the kitchen below, along with the scent of coffee and bacon. Elena dressed quickly in her cleanest clothes and made her way downstairs, following the sounds of domestic life. She found Jake and Lucy at the kitchen table, sharing a newspaper and what appeared to be a heated discussion about livestock prices. "Morning, sunshine," Lucy called out cheerfully. "Sleep well?" "Better than I have in months," Eleanor admitted, accepting the steaming mug of coffee Lucy pressed into her hands. Through the kitchen window, she could see that the storm had indeed blown itself out, leaving behind a world transformed by snow. The mountains gleamed white against a crystalline blue sky, and the sun painted everything with golden light. "Roads are clear enough to get to the cabin," Jake announced, folding the newspaper. "Figured we'd head over after breakfast, see what kind of work we're looking at." Lucy set a plate before Elena that could have fed 3 people. Scrambled eggs, thick cut, bacon, hash browns, and fresh biscuits with honey butter. "Eat up," she instructed. "Mountain air gives you an appetite, and we've got a busy day ahead." As they ate, Jake outlined the plan. The cabin needed cleaning and some basic repairs, but the structure was sound. There was no running water or electricity, but a generator could provide power, and a hand pump accessed the well. The cabin had a wood-burning stove for heat and cooking, and Lucy promised to teach Elena how to manage it properly. "Sounds primitive compared to city living," Jake said, watching Elena's expression carefully. "You sure you're up for it?" Elena thought about her cramped Los Angeles apartment with its broken air conditioning and noisy neighbors, about the constant fear that had colored her last months there. "I think primitive might be exactly what I need right now." After breakfast, they bundled into heavy coats and boots Lucy had found in various closets. Elena's sneakers were completely inadequate for mountain conditions, so Lucy provided a pair of worn but sturdy hiking boots that had belonged to Isabella. They fit perfectly, as if they'd been waiting for Elena all these years. The walk to the cabin took them through snow that reached Elena's knees in places. Jake broke trail, his long strides creating a path the women could follow. The air was so cold it made Elena's lungs burn, but it was clean and sharp in a way that made her feel more awake than she had in years. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, their branches heavy with snow that sparkled in the morning light. It was smaller than Elena had expected, maybe 20 by 30 feet, but perfectly proportioned, with a steep roof designed to shed snow and a covered porch that wrapped around two sides. Jake produced a key from his pocket and unlocked the heavy wooden door. The interior smelled of dust and old wood, but beneath that was something else, a faint trace of lavender and herbs that Elena somehow knew was connected to her grandmother. The single room contained the basics: a bed frame with a bare mattress, a small table and two chairs, shelves built into the walls, and the promised wood-burning stove. Windows on three sides filled the space with light, and Elena could see that on a clear day, the view of the surrounding peaks would be spectacular. "Needs a good cleaning and some basic supplies," Lucy said, running her finger along a dusty shelf. "But it has good bones. Your grandmother loved this place, said it was the first home that was truly hers." Elena walked slowly around the space, trying to imagine her grandmother here as a young woman, pregnant and alone, but finding safety in this mountain sanctuary. She paused at one of the windows, looking out at the view her grandmother would have. "Seen every morning there," Jake said, pointing to a spot near the window. "That's where Maria kept her herb garden. She grew healing plants, things for teas and salves. Some of them still come up every spring, wild now but still growing." The image of her grandmother tending plants in this remote location brought tears to Elena's eyes. She wiped them away quickly, not wanting to seem overly emotional. But Lucy noticed. "It's okay to cry," she said gently. "This place holds a lot of memories, a lot of love. Your grandmother wasn't just surviving here, she was healing." They spent the morning cleaning, hauling out accumulated debris and mouse nests, scrubbing surfaces, and assessing what needed repair. Jake made notes about materials they'd need: new glass for one cracked window, fresh chinking for gaps between, logs, supplies for the stovepipe that showed signs of rust. As they worked, Elena found herself drawn to small details that spoke of her grandmother's presence. Hooks on the wall where Maria had hung herbs to dry. A small shelf built at exactly the right height for someone her grandmother's size. Scratches on the doorframe that looked suspiciously like a growth chart for a child. "Isabella's marks," Lucy confirmed when Eleanor pointed them out. "Your grandmother measured her height every month, right up until—" She trailed off, but Eleanor understood. By noon, they'd made significant progress. The cabin was clean, the stove was operational, and Jake had repaired the worst of the gaps that would let in cold air. Lucy had produced an impressive amount of supplies from seemingly nowhere: bedding, basic cookware, canned goods, and even a battery-powered radio. "Where did all this come from?" Eleanor asked, overwhelmed by their generosity. "We've been collecting supplies for the cabin for years," Jake explained. "Always figured someday it might be needed again. Guess we were right." As they prepared to head back to the main house for lunch, Elena lingered on the cabin porch, reluctant to leave. The silence here was different from the oppressive quiet of her Los Angeles apartment. This was peaceful, filled with the soft sounds of wind in the pines and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. "You don't have to move in today," Lucy said, misunderstanding her hesitation. "Take your time, make sure it's what you really want." "No, it's not that," Elena replied. "It's just, I can feel her here. My grandmother, like she's been waiting for me to come home." That afternoon, Jake drove Elena into Millbrook to gather additional supplies and handle some practical matters. The town looked even more picturesque in daylight, with snow-covered roofs and icicles hanging from Victorian gingerbread trim. But beneath the postcard prettiness, Elena sensed a community of substance, people who worked hard and looked out for each other. Their first stop was the general store, where Jake introduced Elena to Martha Hensley, a woman who appeared to know everything about everyone within a 50-mile radius. Martha's eyes lit up when she heard Elena's surname, Vasquez. "You wouldn't be related to Maria Vasquez, would you? Lord, that woman could work miracles with sick animals. Saved my prize mare once, when the vet said there was no hope." Elena found herself fielding similar reactions throughout the afternoon. At the post office, the bank, the hardware store, everywhere they went, people remembered her grandmother with warmth and respect. It became clear that Maria had been far more than just a refugee seeking shelter. She'd been a valued member of the community. "Your grandmother had a gift," explained Dr. Patricia Morse, the town's physician, when they stopped by her clinic to introduce Elena. "I've got formal medical training, but Maria understood healing in ways that went beyond textbooks. We worked together often. I handled the official medicine. She provided the wisdom." Dr. Morse was a woman in her 60s, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She studied Elena with professional interest. "You have her hands," she observed. "Long fingers, gentle touch. Did she teach you any of her healing knowledge?" Elena thought about the countless hours she'd spent with her grandmother, learning to identify plants, mix teas, prepare simple remedies for common ailments. At the time, it had seemed like old-fashioned folk knowledge, interesting but not particularly relevant to modern life. "Some," she admitted. "She always said plants wanted to help people. You just had to know how to ask them properly." Dr. Morse smiled. "That sounds exactly like something Maria would say. If you decide to stay in Millbrook, I'd be interested in learning what she taught you. Folk medicine and modern medicine don't have to be enemies." As they drove back to the ranch, Elena's mind was spinning with possibilities she hadn't considered. In Los Angeles, her knowledge of herbs and natural remedies had been merely a charming connection to her heritage. Here, it might actually be invaluable, a way to contribute to the community that was welcoming her. "Feeling overwhelmed?" Jake asked, glancing at her as they climbed the mountain road. "A little," Elena admitted. "Everyone expects me to be like her, but I'm not sure I know enough. What if I disappoint them?" "You won't," Jake said with quiet confidence. "Your grandmother didn't become the healer she was overnight. It took years of study, practice, mistakes, and learning. If you decide to walk that path, you'll have plenty of support." That evening, Elena made her decision. She would move into the cabin the next morning and begin building a new life in the mountains. The certainty of it surprised her. She'd always been someone who agonized over decisions, weighing options endlessly, but this felt right in a way that transcended rational analysis. Lucy insisted on one final night in the main house, declaring it an early celebration. She prepared a feast that drew neighbors from miles around. Apparently word had spread that Maria Vasquez's granddaughter had come home. Elena found herself the center of attention in a way that would have terrified her in Los Angeles. but felt natural here. The neighbors who gathered brought food, stories, and genuine warmth. Elena met ranchers, artists, retirees who'd fled city life, and young families drawn by the mountains' promise of space and freedom. Each had stories about her grandmother, memories that painted a picture of a woman who'd found her place in the world after years of searching. "Your grandmother delivered my youngest son," said Anna Kowalski, a potter whose hands were permanently stained with clay. "Doctor was snowed in, and Maria just took charge. Calmed my husband down, boiled water, and talked me through the whole thing like she'd done it 100 times before." "She saved our ranch," added Pete Drummond, an elderly man whose weathered face spoke of decades in the sun. "Cattle got into some poisonous plants, and we thought we'd lose the whole herd. Maria knew exactly what to do, had us feeding them specific herbs, and most of them pulled through." As the evening wore on, Eleanor began to understand that her grandmother's legacy in this place went far beyond the years she'd physically lived here. Maria had become part of the community's story, woven into the fabric of their collective memory. Later, as the neighbors said their goodbyes and headed home through the star-filled night, Eleanor stood on the porch with Jake and Lucy. The cold was intense but invigorating, and the silence was filled with the kind of peace she'd been searching for without knowing it. "Ready for this?" Lucy asked, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Elena looked out at the cabin, barely visible in the moonlight, but somehow calling to her across the snow-covered clearing. "I think I've been ready my whole life. I just didn't know where I was supposed to be." Jake clapped her on the shoulder with gentle affection. "Your grandmother would be proud. She always said this land chose its people, not the other way around." As they headed inside to warm up before bed, Elena felt a sense of completion she'd never experienced before. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Learning to live without modern conveniences, building relationships in a small community, discovering whether she truly had her grandmother's gift for healing. But tonight, she was exactly where she belonged. The last thing she did before sleep was to call her cousin David in Denver. Jake had given her his number, suggesting it was time the scattered branches of their family tree reconnected. David's voice was warm and curious, filled with excitement at discovering he had a cousin he'd never known existed. "Isabella always said she could feel that there was more family out there somewhere," he told her during their hour-long conversation. "She used to stare at the mountains and say she could sense other hearts beating with the same rhythm as ours." They made plans for David to visit soon, possibly bringing his wife and children to meet their newfound family member. The prospect of having real relatives, people connected to her by more than just legal documents or shared experiences, filled Elena with anticipation. As she finally drifted off to sleep in the guest room that had sheltered her grandmother decades earlier, Elena felt the pieces of her life rearranging themselves into a pattern that finally made sense. The fear and uncertainty that had driven her from Los Angeles seemed like memories from someone else's life. Tomorrow, she would begin the next chapter of her story in a cabin surrounded by mountains, following a path her grandmother had carved out of wilderness and hope. The thought no longer frightened her. It felt like coming home to a place she'd been searching for her entire life, a place where she could finally become the person she was meant to be. The wind whistled through the pines outside, carrying with it what Elena could have sworn was the faint scent of lavender and healing herbs, as if her grandmother's spirit was blessing this new beginning. Elena's first week in the cabin passed like scenes from a dream she never wanted to wake from. Each morning brought new discoveries. The way sunlight painted the mountain peaks different colors as it moved across the sky, the intricate patterns frost made on her windows, the profound satisfaction of chopping wood and carrying water from the well. Her city-soft hands developed blisters that hardened into calluses, marking her transformation from urban refugee to mountain dweller. Lucy visited daily, bringing supplies and teaching Elena the practical skills she'd need to survive. Alone, how to bank the fire so it would last through the night, which winds predicted weather changes, how to preserve food without refrigeration. Each lesson felt like receiving pieces of an ancient puzzle, knowledge passed down through generations of women who'd learned to thrive in harsh conditions. "Your grandmother picked up these skills faster than anyone I've ever seen," Lucy said, as she showed Elena how to split kindling properly, like she was remembering rather than learning for the first time. Elena found herself thinking about that observation as she practiced alone in the evenings. There was something familiar about these mountain rhythms, as if her body remembered patterns her mind had never consciously learned. The weight of an axe in her hands felt natural. The smell of wood smoke triggered memories she couldn't quite place. Even the isolation, which should have felt lonely after years of city noise, instead felt like coming home to herself. On her 7th morning in the cabin, Elena woke to an unusual sound, vehicle engines struggling up the mountain road. She peered through the frost-covered window to see a convoy of 3 trucks fighting their way through fresh snowfall that had arrived during the night. This wasn't the familiar rumble of Jake's pickup. These engines strained with unfamiliar effort. Elena dressed quickly and stepped onto her porch, watching the vehicles navigate the narrow road with obvious difficulty. The lead truck bore government plates, and even from a distance she could see the tension in the drivers' postures. They were clearly unaccustomed to mountain driving, city people venturing into territory that challenged their assumptions about accessibility and control. The convoy passed her cabin without stopping, heading toward the main house. Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Government vehicles meant official business, and in her experience, official business rarely brought good news for people trying to start over. She grabbed her heaviest coat and boots, then struck out across the snow-covered field toward the Morrison house. The knee-deep snow made progress slow, and by the time she reached the main yard, the government officials were already inside. Through the kitchen window, she could see Jake and Lucy seated at their table with 3 people in dark suits. 2 men and a woman, all carrying briefcases and wearing expressions of bureaucratic determination. Elena hesitated on the porch, uncertain whether to interrupt what was clearly a serious conversation. But when she saw Lucy's face through the window, pale, with worry and something that looked like fear, she knocked firmly on the door. Jake answered with obvious relief. "Elena, come in. These folks have some questions about land usage and property rights. Seems there might be some legal complications we weren't aware of." The lead official, a stern woman in her 50s with steel-grey hair and calculating eyes, looked up as Elena entered. "And you are?" "Elena Vasquez. I live in the cabin on the property." The woman's expression sharpened with interest. "Vasquez? That's an interesting coincidence. We're here partly because of historical land claims that may involve someone with that exact surname." Elena felt her stomach drop. She'd been so focused on escaping her immediate past that she'd never considered her grandmother might have left behind legal complications. What kind of land claims? The second official, a younger man with nervous energy and an overstuffed briefcase, consulted his papers. "According to our records, Maria Vasquez filed mineral rights claims on this property in 1985, claims that were never officially resolved or transferred." Jake's jaw tightened. "That's impossible. Thomas Brennan owned this land outright. There were no mineral rights disputes." "I'm afraid the paperwork tells a different story," the woman replied coolly. "Ms. Vasquez filed claims suggesting this property contains significant deposits of rare earth minerals. She provided geological surveys and assay reports that were quite detailed. Eleanor exchanged glances with Jake and Lucy, seeing her own confusion reflected in their faces. Her grandmother had never mentioned anything about minerals or geological surveys. Maria Vasquez had been many things: healer, herbalist, survivor, but certainly not a geologist or mining entrepreneur. "There must be some mistake," Elena said. "My grandmother was interested in plants, not minerals. She wouldn't have known how to conduct geological surveys." The third official, an older man who'd remained silent until now, spoke up with a voice that carried decades of bureaucratic authority. "The surveys were quite professional, actually. Detailed core samples, mineral composition analysis, estimated yield projections. Someone with significant expertise prepared these documents." He opened his briefcase and produced a folder thick with papers. "The interesting thing is, recent satellite surveys confirm her findings. This property sits on one of the largest rare earth deposits discovered in Colorado in the past 50 years, worth potentially hundreds of millions of dollars." The room fell silent, except for the ticking of Lucy's grandfather clock and the distant whistle of wind through the pines. Elena felt reality shifting beneath her feet like an avalanche waiting to happen. Her quiet mountain retreat, her grandmother's peaceful sanctuary, suddenly transformed into something else entirely. A prize valuable enough to attract exactly the kind of attention she'd been trying to escape. "What does this mean for the current property owners?" Jake asked, his voice carefully controlled. The stern woman consulted her own papers. "That depends on several factors. If Ms. Vasquez's claims are valid and were properly filed, her heirs would have significant rights to mineral extraction. If the claims are invalid or fraudulent, the current surface rights holders maintain control. We're here to determine which situation applies." Elena's mind raced. What would happen if the mineral rights were separate from the surface rights? "Mining operations," the nervous younger man said, unable to hide his excitement. "Rare earth extraction is a substantial undertaking. It would require heavy equipment, processing facilities, workforce housing. The landscape would be significantly altered." Elena imagined bulldozers and mining trucks tearing through the peaceful valley, crushing her grandmother's herb garden and filling the pristine air with dust and diesel fumes. The thought made her physically ill. "How long do we have to sort this out?" Lucy asked quietly. "The initial review period is 60 days, the woman replied. During that time, we'll be conducting our own surveys and investigating the validity of the original claims. We recommend all parties consult with legal counsel familiar with mineral rights law." After the officials left, promising to return within the week to begin their surveys, Eleanor, Jake, and Lucy sat in the kitchen in stunned silence. The warm, welcoming space that had become Eleanor's sanctuary now felt fragile, threatened by forces beyond their control. "I don't understand," Elena finally said. "My grandmother never mentioned anything about mining or minerals. She loved this land. She would never have done anything to threaten it." Jake stood abruptly and began pacing the kitchen. "Unless she wasn't trying to threaten it. Think about it. If Maria filed mineral rights claims in 1985, that was 3 years after Isabella died. Maybe she was trying to protect the land somehow." "Protect it? How?" Lucy asked. "If you own the mineral rights, you control whether mining happens," Elena said slowly, beginning to understand. "She might have filed the claims to prevent someone else from mining here." Jake stopped pacing. "That would be like Maria. She always thought 3 steps ahead, especially when it came to protecting the people and places she loved." Elena felt a mixture of admiration and terror. If her grandmother had indeed filed protective claims, it showed remarkable foresight and courage. But it also meant Elena had inherited not just a peaceful cabin, but a complex legal battle that could destroy everything her grandmother had tried to preserve. "We need to find those original documents," she said. "If grandmother filed the claims to protect the land, there might be other papers, explanations. something that clarifies her intentions. They spent the afternoon searching through every box, file, and storage area on the property. Jake had kept meticulous records of his grandfather's business dealings, but there was no mention of mineral rights or geological surveys. It was as if Maria's mining claims existed in a parallel universe, documented by government bureaucracy, but invisible to the people who'd actually lived on the land. As evening approached and their search proved fruitless, Elena made a decision that surprised even herself. I need to go back to the cabin and look through my grandmother's things, not the papers she left me, the other things, her personal items. What other things? Lucy asked. Elena realized she'd never mentioned the boxes her grandmother had stored. In a Los Angeles storage unit, items too precious to keep in their small apartment but too meaningful to discard. She had a storage unit, photo albums, documents, things from before she moved to California. I paid the rent through next month, but I never went through everything. Jake frowned. That's a long way to go, and it might not be safe. You said those people in Los Angeles were looking for you. I'll be careful. Quick trip in and out, but if answers exist, they're probably in those boxes. Lucy stood up decisively. Then we're going with you. I'm not letting you face this alone. Lucy, you don't need to. Yes, we do, Jake interrupted. You're family, and family doesn't abandon family when things get complicated. The next morning brought news that made their Los Angeles trip even more urgent. Dr. Morse called to report that strangers had been asking questions around town. Men in expensive suits who didn't quite fit the government official profile. They'd been inquiring about Elena specifically, claiming to be conducting a background check for potential employment. Elena felt the familiar ice-cold fear she'd hoped to leave behind. Marcus Delgado had found her, or at least gotten close enough to matter. The mountain sanctuary that had felt impregnable suddenly seemed as fragile as paper. We leave today, Jake declared after hearing Dr. Morse's report. Whatever's in those storage boxes, we need it now. They drove to Denver in Jake's pickup, then caught a flight to Los Angeles that put them in the city by evening. Elena spent the entire journey fighting anxiety, jumping at every unfamiliar face and unexpected sound. Returning to the place she'd fled felt like walking back into a cage she'd barely escaped. The storage facility was in a rundown part of East LA, surrounded by chain-link fences and security cameras that looked more decorative than functional. Elena led Jake and Lucy through rows of identical metal doors to Unit 247, her hands shaking as she worked the combination lock. The unit was small, but packed with the accumulated memories of a long life. Elena had visited once before, shortly, after her grandmother's funeral, but the emotional weight of sorting through Maria's possessions had been too overwhelming. Now, with urgent purpose driving her, she began pulling boxes into the fluorescent-lit hallway. Look for anything related to Colorado, mining, geology, or legal documents, she instructed, handing each of them a box to examine. Most of the contents were exactly what Elena had expected: photographs spanning decades, religious items, recipes, written in her grandmother's careful script, clothing that still smelled faintly of the herbs Maria had always carried. But in the fourth box Lucy opened, they struck gold. "Elena, look at this," Lucy called softly. She held a manila folder thick with papers, its tab labeled Brennan Ranch, protection documents in her grandmother's handwriting. Inside were copies of the mineral rights claims the government officials had mentioned, but also letters, maps, and what appeared to be a detailed legal strategy. Elena read the first letter with growing amazement. It was addressed to a lawyer in Denver and dated 6 months after Isabella's death. In it, Maria explained that she'd discovered mining companies were planning to survey the Brennan Ranch area for rare earth deposits. She'd somehow learned this information and was determined to prevent the destruction of the land where her daughter was buried. She hired private geologists, Elena read aloud, paid for professional surveys to establish the mineral deposits before the mining companies could file their own claims. Then she filed protective claims to ensure no one could mine without her permission. Jake looked up from a box of photographs. Smart woman. If she controlled the mineral rights, she could block any mining operations indefinitely. But the next document in the folder made Elena's blood run cold. It was a copy of Maria's will, different from the simple document Elena had seen in Los Angeles. This version, filed with the Denver lawyer, contained specific instructions about the mineral rights. In the event of my death, Elena read, all mineral rights claims shall transfer to my granddaughter Elena Vasquez, with the specific instruction that these rights be used to protect the Brennan Ranch from commercial development. Should Elena predecease me or be unable to execute these responsibilities, the rights shall transfer to the Brennan Family Trust. Elena sank down onto a cardboard box, overwhelmed by the magnitude of her inheritance. Her grandmother hadn't just left her a new place to live. She'd left her the responsibility for protecting an entire valley from industrial destruction. There's more, Lucy said quietly, holding up another document. This looks like a legal memo about rare earth mining. Regulations. It's recent, dated just 3 months before your grandmother died. Elena took the memo with shaking hands. It detailed new federal legislation making rare earth mining more profitable and reducing environmental restrictions. Someone had been keeping Maria informed about developments that could threaten the ranch, right up until her death. She knew, Eleanor whispered. Somehow, she knew I might need to come here, and she made sure I'd have the legal tools to protect it. They spent another hour going through the remaining documents, finding a complete legal strategy for protecting the ranch through mineral rights control. Maria had thought of everything: environmental impact studies, water rights documentation, even correspondence with Native American tribal councils about cultural significance of the land. As they prepared to leave the storage facility, Elena felt the weight of her inheritance settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. She'd come to the mountains seeking simple sanctuary and found herself heir to a complex legacy of protection and responsibility. The flight back to Denver was quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts about what they'd discovered. Elena stared out the airplane window at the lights of Los Angeles disappearing below, wondering if she'd ever see the city again. More importantly, she wondered if she was strong enough to fulfill her grandmother's final mission. It wasn't until they were driving back up into the mountains, surrounded once again by the protective embrace of the peaks, that Elena realized the true significance of her grandmother's legal maneuvering. Maria hadn't just protected the land, she'd created a test. Elena now had the power to preserve or destroy the mountain sanctuary that had sheltered 3 generations of women seeking refuge from a complicated world. The question was whether she had the courage and wisdom to use that power well. As they pulled into the ranch yard near midnight, Elena noticed something that made her pulse quicken. Tracks in the snow around her cabin, boot prints too large to be hers, too fresh to be from before their trip. Someone had been there while they were gone, someone who'd circled the building as if looking for a way inside. Jake noticed the tracks at the same moment. "Get in the house," he said quietly. "Now!" As they hurried toward the warmth and safety of the main house, Eleanor realized that her grandmother's legal protections might not be enough. The forces threatening their mountain sanctuary were closing in from multiple directions, and the battle for the land was just beginning. The footprints in the snow told a story Elena didn't want to read. Multiple sets of boots, different sizes, suggesting at least 3 people had circled her cabin while they were in Los Angeles. The intruders had been thorough, checking windows, testing the door, even examining the chimney as if looking for alternative entry points. Most disturbing were the deeper impressions near the back corner, Someone had spent considerable time there, perhaps watching the main house or planning their next move. Jake knelt beside the clearest tracks, his expression grim in the porch. Light. "City boots," he muttered. "Smooth soles, no tread for mountain conditions. These aren't locals." Inside the main house, Lucy immediately began preparing hot drinks while Jake secured the doors and windows. Elena stood at the kitchen window, staring across the snow-covered field toward her violated sanctuary. The cabin that had represented safety and new beginnings now felt exposed, vulnerable to forces she couldn't control. "We need to call Sheriff Martinez," Lucy said, setting mugs of steaming coffee on the table. "Let him know we've got unwanted visitors." "No," Elena said quickly. "Not yet. We don't know who we can trust in official positions. Those government people today, something felt wrong about their timing." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "Too convenient. We discover the mineral rights situation, and suddenly strangers are prowling around, asking questions in town. Either it's a hell of a coincidence, or someone's been watching this property for a while." Eleanor sank into a chair, exhaustion from their frantic trip to Los Angeles finally catching up with her. The documents they'd retrieved lay spread across the kitchen table, her grandmother's careful legal strategy mixed with evidence of threats that stretched back decades. Looking at it all together, a disturbing pattern emerged. "Look at the dates," she said, pointing to various papers. Grandmother filed the initial mineral rights claims in 1985, right after Isabella died. But she kept updating her legal strategy every few years, right up until her death, like she was responding to ongoing threats. Lucy picked up a letter dated just 2 years earlier. This one mentions renewed corporate interest and pressure from federal agencies. Your grandmother wasn't just protecting against theoretical threats, she was fighting an active battle. Jake studied a map showing the ranch boundaries overlaid, with geological survey markers. These mineral deposits don't just cover our property, they extend under at least 6 neighboring ranches. If someone wanted to mine here, they'd need to acquire or control a significant area. The implications sent a chill through Elena that had nothing to do with the mountain cold. Her grandmother's protective claims might have made the ranch the keystone in a much larger corporate acquisition strategy. By inheriting Maria's mineral rights, Elena hadn't just gained protection for her mountain refuge. She'd become the primary obstacle to a mining operation worth potentially billions. "We need help," she admitted. "Legal help, security help, maybe even media help. This is bigger than anything we can handle alone." Before Jake could respond, the phone rang with the sharp insistence that only night calls possess. Lucy answered, with obvious reluctance, her face growing increasingly worried as she listened to the voice on the other end. "That was Martha Hensley at the general store," she said after hanging up. "3 men came in an hour ago asking about the Vasquez woman, staying at Brennan Ranch. They claimed to be private investigators hired by a family member concerned about Elena's welfare." Elena felt her coffee turn to acid in her stomach. "Marcus found me. I don't know how, but he found me." "Who's Marcus?" Jake asked. Elena explained about Marcus Delgado, the criminal organization disguised as a cleaning service, and the witness testimony that had forced her to flee Los Angeles. As she spoke, she watched Jake's expression grow darker with each detail. "So you've got 2 separate groups hunting you," he summarized. "Corporate interests who want to force you off the land, and criminals who want to silence you permanently." 3. Groups, Lucy corrected grimly. "Don't forget those government officials. Something about them didn't feel right either." Elena buried her face in her hands, overwhelmed by the complexity of forces arrayed against her. She'd come to the mountains seeking simple sanctuary, and instead found herself at the center of a multi-layered conflict involving legal, corporate, and criminal interests. Her grandmother's protective strategy was backfiring, making Elena a target instead of keeping her safe. "Maybe I should just sign over the mineral rights," she said desperately. Give them what they want and disappear somewhere else. No. Jake's voice carried absolute conviction. Your grandmother didn't spend 30 years building legal protections just so you could surrender at the first sign of trouble. She chose you for this responsibility because she believed you were strong enough to handle it. But I'm not strong enough, Eleanor protested. I'm just a scared woman who cleaned office buildings for a living. I don't know anything about legal battles or corporate warfare. Lucy reached across the table and grasped Elena's hands firmly. Your grandmother was just a scared pregnant woman when she arrived here. But she learned what she needed to learn, became what she needed to become. The strength is already in you. You just haven't discovered it yet. Their conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of engines struggling up the mountain road. Through the kitchen window, they could see headlights winding through the trees, multiple vehicles moving slowly, carefully, as if their drivers were unfamiliar with the terrain. Jake moved quickly to the gun cabinet, retrieving a rifle and checking its load. Lucy, get Elena upstairs and keep away from the windows. I'll handle whoever this is. But Elena surprised herself by standing up instead of retreating. No, if they're here for me, hiding won't solve anything. Besides, we don't even know if they're hostile. The convoy consisted of 4 vehicles, 2 black SUVs, a white van, and a pickup truck that looked local. They parked in a loose semicircle around the main house, their headlights creating a harsh arena of light and shadow. Car doors opened with military precision, and Elena counted at least 8 figures moving through the illumination. Jake positioned himself by the front door with the rifle, while Lucy dimmed the interior lights to make it harder for anyone outside to see in. Elena stood behind the kitchen counter, her grandmother's legal documents clutched against her chest like a shield. A firm knock echoed through the house, polite but insistent. Jake looked at Elena, waiting for her decision. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded. Whatever was coming, she would face it directly. Jake opened the door with the rifle visible but not threatening. A tall man in an expensive coat stood on the porch, flanked by 2 others who looked like professional security. Behind them, Elena could see more figures positioned around the yard. "Good evening," the man said with practiced courtesy. "I'm Robert Castellanos, representing Apex Mining Corporation. I believe you're harboring someone who has information pertinent to our business interests." Elena stepped into view, deciding that boldness might serve her better than hiding. "I'm Elena Vasquez. What do you want?" Castellanos smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. "Ms. Vasquez, we've been looking for you. May we come in? I think we have matters of mutual interest to discuss." "Say what you need to say from there," Jake interjected, not lowering the rifle. Castellanos shrugged as if the hostility was expected. "Very well. Ms. Vasquez, your grandmother's mineral rights claims have created complications for a development project that would bring significant economic benefits to this region. We're prepared to offer you substantial compensation for transferring those rights to our corporation." Elena felt a surge of anger at his presumptuous tone. "And if I refuse, then we'll be forced to pursue other legal remedies. Mineral rights law is complex, and there are often irregularities in claims filed decades ago. Irregularities that can result in claims being invalidated." The threat was clear, despite its polite delivery. Elena thought about her grandmother's careful documentation, the decades of legal strategy designed to prevent exactly this scenario. Maria had anticipated this moment and prepared Elena for it, even if Elena hadn't understood at the time. "My grandmother's claims are valid and properly filed," she said, with more confidence than she felt. "I have documentation proving their legitimacy." Castellanos exchanged glances with his companions. "Documentation can be misinterpreted or lost. These mountains can be dangerous places, especially for people unfamiliar with local conditions." Jake raised the rifle slightly. "That sounds like a threat." Merely an observation about wilderness safety, Castellanos replied smoothly. Mining operations require extensive security measures. Until development begins, we can't guarantee the safety of unauthorized persons in the area. Elena realized they were trying to intimidate her into signing over the rights immediately, before she could consult lawyers or understand her legal position. The late-night visit, the implied threats, the overwhelming show of force, it was psychological warfare designed to make her feel helpless and isolated. But standing in her grandmother's kitchen, surrounded by evidence of Maria's courage and foresight, Elena felt something shift inside her. These corporate bullies might have money and lawyers, but they didn't have the moral authority that came from protecting something sacred. "Get off our property," she said clearly. "Any further communication can go through my lawyers." Castellanos's mask of courtesy slipped slightly. "You don't have lawyers, Ms. Vasquez. You're a fugitive cleaning woman with no resources and no allies. We're offering you a generous settlement for rights that may not even be valid. I suggest you consider our offer carefully." "The lady said, 'Get off our property,'" Jake growled, taking a step forward. For a moment, the standoff balanced on a knife's edge. Elena could see calculations playing out behind Castellanos' eyes. Was intimidation worth the risk of actual confrontation? Finally, he stepped back with a gesture to his security team. "We'll be in touch, Ms. Vasquez. I hope you'll reconsider our generous offer before complications arise." They retreated to their vehicles with professional efficiency, but Elena noticed they didn't leave immediately. The SUVs repositioned themselves at strategic points around the property perimeter, establishing what looked like surveillance positions, rather than departing entirely. "They're not going anywhere," Jake observed, watching through the window, "planning to maintain pressure until you break." Eleanor felt the walls closing in around her. Corporate intimidation outside, criminal threats from Los Angeles, government officials with questionable motives. Every direction seemed blocked by forces beyond her control. The mountain sanctuary that had promised peace and safety was transforming into a battleground. "I need to contact David," she said suddenly, "my cousin in Denver. If something happens to me, someone in the family should know about the mineral rights situation." Lucy handed her the phone, but when Elena dialed David's number, the call went straight to a message saying the number was no longer in service. A cold dread settled in her stomach. Either David had changed numbers without telling them, or someone had gotten to him first. "Try the Denver directory," Jake suggested, but that search proved equally fruitless. David Morrison wasn't listed. His engineering firm had no record of his employment, and none of his social media profiles showed recent activity. Elena stared at the dead phone in her hands, finally understanding the scope of what they were facing. This wasn't just about mineral rights or corporate greed. Someone was systematically isolating her, cutting off potential allies and escape routes with surgical precision. "Professional work," Jake said grimly when Elena explained about David's disappearance. "Corporate security firms specialize in this kind of pressure campaign. They research your connections, identify vulnerabilities, then exploit them to force. Compliance." As if to emphasize his point, the house phone rang again. This time it was Dr. Morse, calling to report that the three men asking about Elena had returned to Millbrook with more specific questions. They'd visited the bank where Elena had opened an account, the post office where she'd established mail service, even the diner where she'd eaten lunch. Each visit included veiled suggestions that Elena might be involved in illegal activities. "They're poisoning the well," Lucy said after Dr. Morse's disturbing report, "making sure you have no local support when things get worse." Elena walked to the kitchen window and stared out at the corporate vehicles positioned around their property like siege engines. The occupants were probably taking shifts, maintaining constant observation while their employers decided on the next escalation. How long before psychological pressure turned into something more direct? "There is another option," she said quietly, still looking out at their watches. "I could run again. Just disappear, leave the mineral rights behind, start over somewhere else." "That's what they're counting on," Jake replied. "Corporate bullies always prefer retreat to resistance. But running won't solve anything. They'll just move on to the next obstacle with refined tactics." Elena knew he was right. Her grandmother hadn't spent decades building legal protections just so Elena could abandon them at the first sign of serious opposition. But the weight of responsibility felt crushing. She'd never asked to become the guardian of an entire valley, the last line of defense against industrial destruction. As dawn approached and their unwanted watchers maintained their vigil, Elena made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. Instead of planning escape or surrender, she began organizing resistance. "We need allies," she announced. "Real allies with resources and influence, environmental groups, Native American advocacy organizations, journalists who specialize in corporate corruption. If Apex Mining wants a fight, we'll give them one, but it'll be a public fight where their tactics are exposed." Jake smiled with genuine admiration. "Now you're thinking like your grandmother." Lucy began making lists of potential contacts, while Elena studied her inheritance documents with new purpose. Maria's legal strategy had been defensive, designed to block mining through mineral rights control. But Elena was beginning to see possibilities for offense, ways to turn corporate aggression into public relations disasters. The battle for Brennan Ranch was just beginning, and Elena was discovering she had more fight in her than anyone had imagined, including herself. Dawn brought no relief from the siege. Elena watched through the kitchen window as fresh vehicles arrived to replace the night shift, a rotation that spoke of professional planning and unlimited resources. The corporate watchers weren't going anywhere, and their presence had already begun affecting the ranch's daily operations. Delivery trucks turned away rather than navigate the intimidating gauntlet. Neighbors stopped visiting, and even the mail carrier seemed nervous about approaching the house. Elena spent the morning on the phone, reaching out to the contacts Lucy had helped her identify. Environmental lawyers, investigative journalists, Native American tribal councils, anyone who might have an interest in stopping corporate exploitation of sacred lands. The responses varied from cautious interest to outright enthusiasm, but each conversation reinforced the same message. She needed documentation, evidence, and public support to fight a corporation with Apex Mining's resources. "The good news is, you're not alone," said Rebecca Chen, an environmental lawyer from Denver who'd agreed to review Elena's case. "Rare earth mining has become a hot-button issue, especially when it threatens pristine wilderness areas. The bad news is Apex has probably spent months preparing for this fight. They wouldn't have moved so aggressively without believing they could win." Eleanor took notes as Rebecca explained the legal landscape surrounding mineral rights disputes. Federal regulations favored development over conservation, and corporate lawyers were skilled at finding procedural flaws in decades-old claims. Elena's best defense lay not in the courtroom, but in the court of public opinion. "Environmental impact studies take time," Rebecca continued. "If we can force a comprehensive review of the ecological damage mining would cause, we might be able to delay operations long enough to build political opposition." As Elena finished her legal consultation, Jake burst through the kitchen door with news that changed everything. "There's been an accident in town, or what they're calling an accident. Dr. Morse's clinic had been broken into during the night. The intruders had ransacked her files, apparently searching for Elena's medical records and any documentation connecting her to the ranch. But they'd been careless, leaving behind evidence of their search and triggering a security system Dr. Morse had recently installed. Patricia's fine, Jake assured them quickly, but she's shaken up. Says the men who broke in were professionals. They knew exactly what they were looking for and how to avoid leaving fingerprints. Elena felt sick. The harassment was spreading beyond the ranch, targeting anyone who'd shown her kindness or support. Dr. Morse had welcomed Elena into the community, sharing memories of her grandmother and offering professional assistance. Now, she was paying the price for that generosity. It gets worse, Jake continued. Sheriff Martinez called this morning. 3 more businesses in Millbrook were broken into last night: the bank, the post office, and Martha Hensley's general store. All places where Eleanor had conducted business. Lucy sank into a chair. They're looking for something specific, something they think Elena might have shared or stored with local contacts. Elena thought about the documents they'd retrieved from her grandmother's storage unit, now spread across the kitchen table. The legal papers were comprehensive, but she couldn't shake the feeling they were missing something crucial. Her grandmother had been too thorough, too strategic to rely solely on mineral rights claims for protection. There's something else, she said slowly, something grandmother hid that even we haven't found yet. Jake raised an eyebrow. What makes you think that? Elena gestured at the papers covering the table. Look at the pattern. Every document here refers to other documentation. Geological surveys reference environmental impact studies. Legal briefs mention historical research. But we haven't found the actual studies, the historical documents, the scientific evidence supporting the legal claims. Lucy leaned forward with interest. You think Maria hid additional evidence somewhere? I think she created multiple layers of protection. The mineral rights claims were just the first line of defense. If those failed, she'd need backup evidence to support appeals or public campaigns. Elena's phone rang, interrupting her speculation. The caller ID showed a Denver area code she didn't recognize, but something compelled her to answer, despite her growing paranoia about unknown contacts. Elena, thank God. The voice was David's, but strained with exhaustion and fear. Don't say my name out loud, just listen. Elena felt relief and terror in equal measure. Her cousin was alive, but the tension in his voice suggested he was far from safe. She gestured for Jake and Lucy to stay quiet, then activated the phone's speaker so they could hear. I've been hiding since yesterday, David continued in hushed tones. Men came to my house, my office, everywhere I might be. They're not government officials and they're not police. Professional muscle pretending to be investigators. Where are you now? Elena asked quietly. Safe house. A friend who owes me favors, but I can't stay here long. Elena, there's something about our family history you need to know, something Isabella discovered before she died. Elena's heart pounded. What kind of something? David's voice dropped even lower. The land isn't just valuable for rare earth minerals. There's something else buried there. Something that connects to why our great-grandmother originally fled Mexico. Isabella found evidence, historical documents that explained why Maria was so desperate to protect that specific area. Elena exchanged glances with Jake and Lucy. Another layer of family secrets, more complexity added to an already overwhelming situation. What kind of evidence? I can't explain over the phone. Too dangerous. But I have copies of what Isabella found, hidden, where they'll never think to look. We need to meet, but not at the ranch. They're watching everything there. Elena felt the walls closing in again. Meeting David would mean leaving the relative safety of the ranch, venturing into territory where corporate security could operate more freely. But whatever information he possessed might be crucial to understanding her grandmother's full strategy. Where? She asked. David gave her directions to an abandoned mining town 30 miles south of Millbrook, accessible only by rough mountain roads that would discourage casual surveillance. They arranged to meet that evening, when darkness would provide additional cover. After ending the call, Elena stared at the documents scattered across the table with new understanding. Her grandmother's protection strategy had multiple dimensions. She'd never suspected. The mineral rights claims were just the visible layer designed to draw attention while concealing deeper secrets. "I'm going with you," Jake declared when Elena explained about the meeting. "It's too dangerous. If something happens to me, someone needs to stay here and continue the fight." "If something happens to you, there won't be a fight," Lucy pointed out. "You're the only one with legal standing to challenge the mining operations." Eleanor realized they were right. Her death or disappearance would remove the primary obstacle to Apex Mining's plans. Whatever protection her grandmother had built into the legal framework depended on Elena's continued presence and active participation. They spent the afternoon preparing for the evening journey. Jake cleaned and loaded weapons, Lucy packed emergency supplies, and Elena studied topographical maps of the route to the abandoned mining town. The roads were treacherous even in good weather, and recent snowfall would make them nearly impassable for vehicles without four-wheel drive. As evening approached, their corporate watches showed signs of increased activity. Additional vehicles arrived, and Elena could see figures moving through the trees around the property perimeter. The siege was tightening, as if Apex sensed that something important was about to happen. "They're planning something," Jake observed, watching the surveillance team through binoculars. Too much movement for routine observation. Elena felt time running out, like sand through her fingers. Whatever David had discovered might be her only chance to understand the full scope of her inheritance and develop an effective defense strategy. But leaving the ranch now felt like walking into a trap. The decision was made for them when Lucy spotted smoke rising from the direction of Elena's cabin. They rushed outside to see orange flames licking at the building's roof, spreading with suspicious speed despite the recent snow. The fire was too intense, too well established to be accidental. "Distraction," Jake said grimly. "They're trying to flush us out or divide our attention." Elena watched her mountain sanctuary burn with a mixture of grief and rage. The cabin where her grandmother had found peace, where Elena had begun building a new life, was being destroyed by corporate intimidation. But even as tears stung her eyes, she recognized the tactical brilliance of the move. Emergency responders would arrive, soon creating chaos and opportunity for Apex's security team to operate more freely. "We leave now," she decided, "before they can spring whatever trap they're preparing." They loaded Jake's pickup with essential supplies and the most important documents from her grandmother's collection. As they prepared to depart, Elena took one last look at the burning cabin and made a silent promise. When this was over, she would rebuild not just the structure, but the sanctuary it represented. Her grandmother's legacy would survive corporate aggression. The route to the abandoned mining town led through increasingly treacherous terrain. Jake navigated hairpin turns and steep grades with the skill of someone who'd driven these mountains for decades, but Eleanor could see the strain in his concentration. Snow began falling again, reducing visibility and making the roads even more dangerous. They'd been driving for an hour when Jake spotted headlights in the rearview mirror. "Company," he announced grimly. Elena turned to see multiple vehicles following them at a distance, their lights occasionally disappearing around curves but always reappearing. The pursuit was professional, maintaining contact without closing distance, suggesting their followers knew the destination and weren't worried about losing the trail. "They're herding us," Jake realized, "letting us reach the meeting point where they can control the terrain." Elena felt the familiar chill of panic, but forced herself to think strategically. If Apex was willing to commit resources to stopping this meeting, David's information must be truly damaging to their interests. That made it even more crucial to complete the rendezvous despite the risks. The abandoned mining town appeared suddenly around a bend in the road, its skeletal buildings stark against the snow-covered mountainside. Most structures had collapsed decades ago, leaving only stone foundations and rusted equipment to mark human ambition that had ended in failure. But one building remained partially intact, an old mine office with walls solid enough to provide shelter. David's truck was already there, parked behind the building where it couldn't be seen from the main road. Eleanor felt relief at the sight, followed immediately by concern about the vehicles still following them. Whatever reunion awaited, it would be brief and potentially dangerous. They parked beside David's truck and hurried into the abandoned office. The building was freezing, filled with debris from years of weather damage, but the walls were thick enough to muffle conversation and provide some protection from observation. David emerged from the shadows looking haggard and frightened. But when he saw Elena, his expression brightened with genuine relief. They embraced briefly, the first time she'd hugged a blood relative since her grandmother's death. "Thank God you're safe," he said. "When I heard about the break-ins in Millbrook, I was afraid they'd already gotten to you." Elena introduced Jake and Lucy, explaining how her grandmother's friends had become her protectors and allies. David listened with growing amazement as she described the mineral rights situation and corporate intimidation campaign. "It's worse than I thought," he said when she finished. "What I have to show you explains why they're so desperate to get that land." David produced a waterproof case from his jacket, opening it to reveal photocopied documents that looked much older than her grandmother's legal papers. The pages were covered with Spanish text, faded photographs, and hand-drawn maps that seemed to chart something far more significant than mining claims. "Isabella found these in the ranch house attic," David explained, "hidden inside a trunk that belonged to our great-great-grandmother, the woman who originally fled Mexico and eventually ended up in Colorado." Elena studied the documents with growing amazement. They appeared to be deeds, surveys, and correspondence dating back to the 1880s, but as David translated the Spanish text, she realized they represented something far more valuable than property records. "Our ancestor wasn't just fleeing poverty or political persecution," David continued. "She was fleeing with stolen treasure, gold and silver taken from a Mexican mining operation that was exploiting indigenous workers. She hid it somewhere on what's now the Brennan Ranch." Jake whistled low. "Buried treasure. No wonder everyone's so interested in that land." "It gets better," David said, producing another set of documents. "The treasure wasn't just valuable, it was cursed, according to indigenous beliefs. Taking it from its original location brought misfortune to anyone who possessed it. Our great-great-grandmother spent years trying to return it to its proper place, but died before she could complete the task." Elena felt pieces of a massive puzzle clicking into place. Her grandmother's fierce protection of the land wasn't just about environmental conservation or family sentiment. Maria had been guarding a sacred responsibility passed down through generations, the obligation to return stolen wealth to its rightful place. The mineral rights claims were never about preventing mining, she realized. They were about maintaining control long enough to complete our ancestors' mission. David nodded grimly. Isabella figured it out shortly before she died. She was planning to excavate the treasure and return it to the appropriate tribal authorities. But her accident cut the mission short. Elena stared at the documents, understanding finally why corporate and government forces were so determined to control the ranch. The rare earth minerals were valuable, but a cache of 19th century gold and silver could be worth even more. And if word leaked about the treasure's existence, it would trigger a modern gold rush that would destroy the mountain sanctuary forever. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of vehicles surrounding the building. Through gaps in the walls, Elena could see lights positioning themselves to cover all possible exits. The corporate security team had arrived in force, ready to end the family reunion permanently. "How many ways out of here?" Jake asked David. Checking his rifle, David pointed toward a shaft entrance partially hidden by debris. Old mine tunnel. It connects to the main mine complex about a quarter-mile up the mountain. But it's been unstable for decades. Elena looked at the tunnel entrance, then at the lights surrounding their position. They could surrender and hope for corporate mercy, or risk everything on a dangerous escape through abandoned mine workings. The decision was made for them when a voice echoed across the snow, amplified by a bullhorn. "This is private security, acting under federal authority. Exit the building with your hands visible. You are trespassing on a secured archaeological site." Elena almost laughed at the irony. Apex was claiming federal authority to protect an archaeological site while planning to destroy it with mining operations. But the legal fiction would provide cover for whatever they planned to do with inconvenient witnesses. The tunnel, she decided. Whatever's in there can't be worse than what's waiting out here. As they gathered the precious documents and prepared to enter the dark mouth of the abandoned mine, Elena realized her transformation was complete. She'd arrived in the mountains as a frightened refugee seeking simple sanctuary. Now she was a guardian of family secrets, protector of sacred ground, and the last obstacle between corporate greed and environmental destruction. The battle for her inheritance was about to move underground, into territories where corporate security's advantages might not matter as much as knowledge, courage, and the kind of determination that had sustained her family through generations of struggle. Behind them, the voices grew more insistent, but Eleanor was already disappearing into the darkness of the mine, carrying with her the keys to mysteries that stretched back more than a century. The mine tunnel plunged into absolute darkness that seemed to swallow their flashlight beams like hungry mouths. Elena followed David deeper into the mountain's belly, her boots crunching on a century's worth of debris, while ancient timbers groaned ominously overhead. The air grew thicker with each step, carrying the metallic taste of rusted iron and something else, a sweet, earthy smell that might have been decay or mineral deposits. Behind them, voices echoed from the entrance as corporate security discovered their escape route. Elena could hear heated discussions about pursuit protocols and structural safety assessments. Their hesitation bought precious time, but she knew professional operators wouldn't be deterred by dark tunnels for long. "How far is the main complex?" Jake whispered, his rifle ready despite the confined space. David consulted a hand-drawn map by flashlight. "Maybe half a mile through this section, then up through the ventilation shaft to the processing level." "But Elena, there's something I didn't mention earlier. Isabella wasn't just researching our family history when she found those documents. She was following specific directions." Elena felt cold that had nothing to do with underground temperature. "What kind of directions?" "Instructions for finding the treasure cache. Our great-great-grandmother left detailed notes about its location, hidden in the same trunk with the other documents. Isabella was planning to retrieve it when she had her accident." The implications sent Elena's mind racing. If Isabella had been actively searching for the treasure, her death might not have been the random climbing accident everyone believed. Corporate interests had been monitoring the ranch for decades. They might have been watching family members as well. "You think Isabella was murdered?" Lucy asked, voicing Elena's fears. David's expression grew grim in the flashlight glow. "I think Isabella got too close to something powerful people wanted to keep buried, and now we're following the same path." They continued deeper into the mine, navigating passages that branched and twisted through the mountain's interior like arteries in a massive body. Some tunnels partially collapsed, forcing them to crawl through gaps barely wide enough for human passage. Others opened into chambers so vast their lights couldn't reach the ceiling. Elena found herself thinking about the indigenous workers her ancestor had witnessed being exploited in Mexican mines over a century ago. These Colorado tunnels probably told similar stories of dangerous labor, cave-ins, and lives sacrificed for mineral wealth. The corporate security forces pursuing them represented the same callous calculation. Human costs were acceptable if profits justified them. "Stop," David whispered suddenly, raising his hand for silence. They froze in a natural chamber where several passages converged, listening intently. Over their own breathing and the mountain's settling sounds, Elena could hear something else: footsteps, echoing from multiple directions. Their pursuers had split up, attempting to surround them in the underground maze. Jake studied the chamber's layout, identifying defensive positions among the rock formations. "How many entrances to this space?" David counted quickly. "5 that I can see, maybe more hidden by shadows." Elena realized they'd walked into a trap. The mine's complexity that had seemed like protection was now working against them, providing multiple access routes for their enemies while limiting their own escape options. Corporate security had probably studied these tunnels extensively while planning their mining operation. "There," Lucy pointed to a narrow passage barely visible, "between fallen timbers. That looks like it heads upward, might connect to surface ventilation." They moved toward the passage, but stopped when lights appeared in 2 of the other tunnels simultaneously. Professional voices coordinated movement with military precision, suggesting their pursuers were experienced in underground operations. Elena made a desperate decision. "David, give me Isabella's directions to the treasure. If something happens to us, someone needs to complete her mission." David hesitated, understanding the implications. Giving Elena the location meant accepting that their family's secret might die with them if the escape failed, but keeping it hidden ensured the treasure would remain lost forever. He pulled out a folded paper covered with Isabella's handwriting, a translation of their ancestors' Spanish instructions, combined with modern topographical references. "The cache is hidden in a natural cave system beneath the ranch house. Access through the old root cellar, then follow the underground stream for exactly 847 steps. The treasure chamber is marked with carved symbols our ancestor left as identification." Elena memorized the crucial details, then tucked the paper inside, her jacket next to her grandmother's rosary. If she survived the next hour, she would have the information needed to complete a mission that had waited over a century for resolution. Their conversation was interrupted by the appearance of tactical lights in 3 separate tunnels. The corporate security team was closing in with professional efficiency, using night vision equipment and communication devices that gave them massive advantages in the underground environment. Jake positioned himself behind a rock formation that provided cover while offering clear sight lines to the approaching threats. "When I start shooting, run for that upward passage. Don't stop, don't look back. Get to the surface and contact Rebecca Chen. She'll know what to do with the information." Eleanor felt tears stinging her eyes. "I'm not leaving you behind." "Yes, you are," Jake said firmly. "Your grandmother didn't spend 30 years building protection just so you could throw it away on a gesture. You're the only one who can stop the mining operation and return the treasure to its rightful place." Before Elena could protest further, the first security operative appeared in the tunnel entrance, weapon raised and night vision goggles glowing green in the darkness. Jake's rifle spoke once, the sound deafening in the confined space, and the figure collapsed. Chaos erupted as multiple teams converged on their position from different directions. Jake's rifle cracked repeatedly while Lucy dragged Elena toward the upward passage. David followed, clutching the precious documents against his chest like protective talismans. The passage was steeper than it appeared, requiring them to climb over fallen rocks and squeeze through gaps where ceiling collapses had nearly blocked the route. Behind them, the sound of gunfire gradually faded, replaced by pursuing voices and the echo of boots on stone. "Jake!" Elena called desperately, but Lucy pulled her forward relentlessly. "He knows these mountains better than anyone," Lucy said through gritted teeth. "If anyone can escape those tunnels, it's Jake, but only if we don't waste his sacrifice." They climbed for what felt like hours through passages that grew progressively narrower and more unstable. Ancient support timbers had rotted away, leaving only precarious stone formations to hold up thousands of tons of mountain. Elena found herself praying to her grandmother's memory, asking for strength to complete the mission that had cost so many lives already. The passage finally opened into a wider chamber where Elena could see stars through a crack in the ceiling. Fresh air flowed down from the opening, carrying the scent of pine and snow that meant freedom. But the crack was 20 feet above them, accessible only by climbing a treacherous wall of loose rock and jutting stone. David went first, testing, each handhold carefully before committing his weight. Elena followed, her muscles screaming from exhaustion and fear. Lucy climbed last, pausing occasionally to listen for sounds of pursuit from the passage below. They emerged into the Colorado night through what had once been a mine ventilation shaft, now disguised by decades of vegetation growth. Elena lay, on her back in the snow, staring up at stars that seemed impossibly bright after hours in underground darkness. The simple act of breathing clean air felt like a miracle. But their escape was incomplete. They were miles from the ranch, without transportation, carrying information that multiple groups would kill to possess. The mountain wilderness that had seemed like a sanctuary now felt exposed and dangerous. Jake's truck, David remembered. Suddenly, he had GPS tracking installed after some equipment thefts last year. If we can reach a phone, we might be able to locate him. Elena felt hope flickering despite their desperate circumstances. Jake was resourceful, experienced, and intimately familiar with the mountain terrain. He might have found another exit, another route to safety that corporate security hadn't anticipated. They began the long trek through snow-covered wilderness toward the nearest road, following game trails and creek beds that provided some concealment from aerial surveillance. Elena used the time to organize her thoughts about everything they'd discovered: the treasure location, the historical documents, the corporate conspiracy that stretched back decades. Her grandmother's protection strategy finally made complete sense. Maria hadn't just been guarding mineral rights or environmental preservation. She'd been protecting a sacred trust that connected their family to indigenous communities whose ancestors had been exploited and murdered for their wealth. Returning the treasure wasn't about monetary value. It was about healing historical wounds and honoring indigenous sovereignty. They reached a Forest Service road just as dawn painted the eastern peaks with golden light. Elena could see tire tracks in the fresh snow, but no sign of vehicles or human activity. The isolation that usually characterized these mountain roads now felt ominous rather than peaceful. David flagged down the first vehicle that appeared, a Forest Service truck driven by a ranger who recognized him from previous encounters. Elena held her breath as David explained they needed help contacting emergency services about a missing person in the old mine complex. The ranger, a weathered man named Tom Kowalski, listened with growing concern. "That's a dangerous country, especially in winter. We've had several accidents in those abandoned workings over the years. I'll radio for search and rescue, but it might take hours to organize a proper response." Elena felt time slipping away like snow through her fingers. Every hour Jake remained missing increased the likelihood that corporate security would find him first, and every hour she delayed completing Isabella's mission gave their enemies more time to plan countermeasures. "I need to get back to Brennan Ranch," she told David quietly while the ranger coordinated rescue efforts. "The treasure location is specific, 847 steps from the root cellar. I need to verify Isabella's directions before corporate security realizes what we're really looking for." David looked torn between concern for Jake's safety and understanding of Elena's urgency. "It's too dangerous. They'll be watching the ranch, waiting for you to return. Then I'll have to be smarter than they expect." Elena studied the ranges. Map, calculating distances and travel times. The ranch was 15 miles through mountainous terrain, but she knew shortcuts through wilderness areas where vehicles couldn't follow. It would be dangerous, especially alone, but waiting would be more dangerous. As search and rescue teams organized to look for Jake, Elena slipped away from the group with supplies Tom Kowalski had provided: emergency food, water, warm clothing, and a GPS unit. She left David with instructions to contact Rebecca Chen and the other environmental lawyers if she didn't return within 24 hours. The hike to Brennan Ranch tested every survival skill she'd learned during her weeks in the mountains. Elena navigated by landmarks her grandmother had probably known: distinctive rock formations, creek crossings, stands of ancient trees that had survived countless seasons. The connection to family history gave her strength when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her determination. She reached the ranch boundary as afternoon shadows lengthened across the snow-covered fields. The main house looked deceptively peaceful, but Elena could see vehicle tracks around the property perimeter and movement in windows that suggested ongoing surveillance. Corporate security was maintaining their watch, waiting for her inevitable return. Elena circled wide around the main buildings, approaching her grandmother's cabin site from the wooded side where burned timbers still smoldered in the snow. The sight of her destroyed sanctuary sent anger coursing through her veins, fuel for the dangerous mission ahead. The root cellar David had mentioned was hidden beneath the main house's kitchen, accessible through a trapdoor that generations of ranch families had used for food storage. Elena would need to get inside the house without alerting the watchers, find the cellar entrance, and follow Isabella's directions to the treasure chamber. As darkness fell across the mountains, Elena prepared for the most important gamble of her life. Everything, her grandmother's legacy, the environmental protection of the valley, the completion of her ancestors' sacred mission, depended on the next few hours. She whispered a prayer to her grandmother's spirit, asking for guidance and protection, then began moving through the shadows toward the house where multiple generations of her family had found sanctuary and purpose. Tonight, she would either complete the circle of responsibility that connected her to a century of family sacrifice, or die trying. The mountain wind carried the scent of snow and pine, but underneath those familiar smells, Eleanor could swear she detected something else: the faint aroma of healing herbs and lavender that had always surrounded her grandmother. Maria's spirit was with her, she realized, guiding her steps toward a destiny that had been waiting her entire life to unfold. Elena crouched in the darkness behind the old barn, watching the corporate security teams patrol the ranch grounds with military precision. Their thermal imaging equipment swept the area in systematic patterns, but the barn's thick stone walls provided enough insulation to mask her heat signature. She'd been waiting 3 hours for the perfect moment to approach the main house, and that moment was finally arriving. The security rotation followed a predictable schedule. Every 45 minutes, both teams converged at the command vehicle, parked near the front gate to report status and receive new instructions. During those 5-minute briefings, a gap opened in their perimeter coverage that would allow Eleanor to reach the house's back entrance undetected. As the guards gathered for their next meeting, Eleanor sprinted across the snow-covered yard to the kitchen door. Her grandmother's key still worked, though it turned with the rusty protest of metal that hadn't been used in weeks. The familiar scent of wood smoke and herbs greeted her as she slipped inside, but the house felt different, violated by the presence of strangers who'd searched through family memories like grave robbers. The kitchen trapdoor was exactly where David had described, hidden beneath a braided rug that Elena's grandmother had probably walked over thousands of times. The iron ring handle lifted with surprising ease, revealing wooden steps that descended into absolute darkness. Elena clicked on her flashlight and began the descent into her family's buried secrets. The root cellar was larger than she'd expected, with stone walls that spoke of pioneer craftsmanship and determination. Shelves lined the walls, still holding mason jars filled with preserved foods that Lucy had probably canned the previous summer. But Elena's attention focused on the far corner, where a natural spring bubbled up through the floor stones and disappeared into a passage barely wide enough for human passage. This was the underground stream Isabella's directions had mentioned, 847 steps to the treasure chamber. Elena knelt beside the water and whispered a prayer to her grandmother's memory, asking for strength and guidance for the journey ahead. Then she squeezed into the passage and began following the stream deeper into the mountain's heart. The tunnel was natural rather than man-made, carved by centuries of water flow through limestone formations. Elena had to crouch most of the way, sometimes crawling through sections where the ceiling dropped to within inches of the stream's surface. The water was shockingly cold against her hands and knees, but she forced herself to maintain steady progress while counting each step carefully. At step 423, the tunnel opened into a wider chamber where ancient cave paintings covered the walls, symbols and figures that spoke of indigenous peoples who'd considered this place sacred long before European settlers arrived. Elena paused to study the artwork, recognizing some of the symbols from her grandmother's healing rituals. This wasn't just a hiding place. It was a shrine, a sacred space that her ancestor had somehow known to respect. She continued following the stream, her count reaching 600, then 700, then finally approaching the crucial 847th step. The tunnel had been gradually ascending, and Elena could feel air movement that suggested connection to surface ventilation. At exactly 847 steps, she found what Isabella's directions had promised, a side chamber marked with carved symbols that matched those in the historical documents. Elena's flashlight beam revealed a space that took her breath away. The chamber was roughly circular, with a domed ceiling that sparkled with mineral deposits. But it was the chamber's contents that made her gasp in amazement. Wooden chests lined the walls, their iron bindings green with age, but still intact. Between the chests, artifacts were carefully arranged on stone ledges: pottery, jewelry, religious items, and what appeared to be ceremonial weapons. This wasn't just hidden treasure. It was a museum of indigenous culture, carefully preserved and protected for over a century. Elena's ancestor hadn't stolen random gold and silver. She'd rescued sacred artifacts and ceremonial objects from Mexican mining operations that were destroying indigenous burial sites and holy places. Elena opened the nearest chest with trembling hands, revealing not the gold coins she'd expected, but carefully wrapped bundles containing items of spiritual rather than monetary value. Each bundle bore tags written in Spanish, identifying the tribal origin and ceremonial purpose of the contents. Her ancestor had been an archivist as well, as a rescuer, documenting each item's significance for eventual return to appropriate communities. As Elena explored the chamber, she began to understand why her grandmother had been so determined to protect this land. The treasure wasn't about family wealth. It was about honoring indigenous sovereignty and healing historical wounds. Returning these artifacts to their rightful communities would be worth far more than any mining operation's profits. A sound from the tunnel entrance interrupted her exploration, footsteps echoing against stone walls, moving with the confident pace of someone following a known route. Elena's heart pounded as she realized corporate security had discovered the passage and was approaching the chamber. She'd been so absorbed in the treasure's significance that she'd lost track of time and tactical awareness. Elena quickly photographed several bundles and their identifying tags, creating evidence of the chamber's contents that could survive even if she didn't. Then she looked for alternative exits, hoping the chamber connected to other passages that might offer escape routes. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by voices that confirmed her worst fears. Motion sensors detected movement in the underground section, one voice reported. Subject is definitely down here somewhere. Elena found what she was looking for, a narrow crack in the chamber's back wall that exhaled cool air, suggesting connection to the mountain's surface. But squeezing through would mean abandoning the treasure to corporate interests, who would probably destroy it rather than acknowledge its cultural significance. As tactical lights appeared in the tunnel entrance, Elena made a decision that would have made her grandmother proud. Instead of fleeing, she stepped into the chamber's center and raised her hands in surrender. The treasure was too important to abandon, and sometimes protection required sacrifice. Elena Vasquez called a familiar voice. Robert Castellanos emerged from the tunnel, flanked by armed security personnel who looked distinctly uncomfortable in the sacred space. "You've led us quite a chase. I hope you've found what you were looking for." Elena studied his face in the harsh LED illumination, seeing greed mixed with something that might have been respect. "You know what this place represents. These aren't just valuable objects. They're sacred artifacts stolen from indigenous communities. Destroying them would be cultural genocide." Castellanos gestured to the chests surrounding them. "What I see is a fortune in pre-Columbian artifacts that could fund mining operations for decades. Your ancestor was quite the collector." "She was a protector," Elena corrected firmly. "These items were rescued from destruction, not stolen for profit. Look at the documentation. Each piece is catalogued for return to its rightful community." For a moment, uncertainty flickered in Castellanos' expression. The chamber's sacred atmosphere seemed to affect even corporate security professionals, creating hesitation where there should have been decisive action. That hesitation saved Elena's life when Jake Morrison appeared from another tunnel entrance like an avenging angel. His rifle spoke twice before anyone could react, and 2 security guards collapsed while Castellanos dove behind a chest for cover. "Down!" Jake shouted, and Elena threw herself behind the nearest stone formation as gunfire erupted in the sacred chamber. The firefight was brief but intense, muzzle flashes illuminating ancient cave paintings, while modern weapons violated a space that had known only peace for over a century. When the shooting stopped, Castellanos lay wounded but alive, his remaining security team either dead or fled. Jake emerged from cover with obvious relief at finding Elena unharmed. "David's organizing tribal councils and environmental groups. Upstairs," he reported breathlessly. "Media crews are already arriving. Your cousin did good work while we were underground." Elena felt tears of gratitude and exhaustion streaming down her face. "I thought you were dead. How did you escape the mine tunnels?" "Old mining tunnels connect all through these mountains," Jake explained, while applying first aid to Castellanos' shoulder wound. "I knew passages they didn't, led them on a chase through half the county before doubling back here." As they helped the wounded Castellanos toward the tunnel entrance, Elena took one last look at the treasure chamber. Tomorrow it would be crawling, with archaeologists, tribal representatives, and media crews documenting one of the most significant indigenous artifact discoveries in Colorado history. Apex Mining's operation would be delayed indefinitely, while cultural impact studies determined the proper stewardship of the sacred space. They emerged from the root cellar to find the ranch yard transformed into a media circus. News trucks lined the driveway, while reporters interviewed David about the family's century-long guardianship of stolen indigenous artifacts. Environmental lawyers worked with tribal representatives to establish legal protections for the site, while federal archaeologists prepared to conduct comprehensive surveys. Elena stood on the kitchen porch, watching dawn paint the mountain peaks with golden light, while chaos swirled around her transformed sanctuary. Her grandmother's protection strategy had worked perfectly, but not in ways anyone could have predicted. The mineral rights claims had been just the beginning. The real protection came from cultural and historical significance that transcended corporate interests. Dr. Patricia Morse appeared at Elena's side, carrying a steaming mug of coffee and wearing the satisfied expression of someone whose faith in justice had been vindicated. "Your grandmother would be proud," she said simply. "She always said this land chose its own protectors." As the media attention continued, Eleanor found herself thinking about Isabella, whose curiosity and courage had started the chain of events leading to this moment. Her death might not have been accidental, but her legacy would live on in the cultural preservation her research had made possible. Sheriff Martinez approached with official paperwork, transferring custody of the wounded Castellanos to federal authorities. Corporate intimidation and destruction of archaeological sites carried serious federal penalties, especially when indigenous cultural rights were involved. Apex mining would face years of legal battles and public relations disasters rather than the quick profit they'd expected. Elena watched their former tormentor being loaded into an ambulance, feeling neither satisfaction nor sympathy. He'd been a tool of corporate greed, but the real victory lay in protecting something far more valuable than money: the cultural heritage of peoples whose ancestors had considered these mountains sacred. As the morning progressed, representatives from 3 different tribal councils arrived to examine the artifacts and begin repatriation discussions. Elena found herself serving as intermediary between her family's guardianship and indigenous sovereignty, a role that felt both humbling and purposeful. "Your ancestor understood something most people never learn," explained Dr. Sarah Crowfeather, a tribal historian whose grandmother had grown up on nearby reservations. "Protecting sacred places isn't about ownership, it's about responsibility. Your family has honored that responsibility for 4 generations." Elena accepted the praise with a mixture of pride and determination. Her grandmother's mission was complete, but Elena's own mission was just beginning. The ranch would need continued protection, the artifacts required proper stewardship, and the mountain ecosystem deserved guardians who understood its sacred significance. Late that evening, after the media crews departed and official business concluded, Elena stood in her grandmother's garden where healing herbs pushed through the snow. The cabin would be rebuilt, the treasure chamber would become a properly managed cultural site, and the ranch would continue serving as sanctuary for those seeking peace in the mountains. Jake and Lucy joined her in the garden, their faces reflecting the exhaustion and satisfaction of a battle well fought. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: legal proceedings, environmental studies, cultural negotiations. But tonight, they could rest in the knowledge that they'd protected something irreplaceable. "What happens now?" Lucy asked, gesturing toward the main house where federal agents maintained security around the treasure site. Elena smiled, feeling her grandmother's presence in the mountain wind that carried the scent of healing herbs and eternal snow. "Now, we become what we were always meant to be, protectors of this sacred place, not because we own it, but because it chose us." As stars appeared in the clear mountain sky, Elena realized her transformation was complete. She'd arrived as a frightened refugee, seeking simple sanctuary. Now she was a guardian of cultural heritage, protector of sacred ground, and keeper of family secrets that connected her to something far greater than herself. Over the following weeks, Elena's life evolved into patterns she couldn't have imagined during her desperate flight from Los Angeles. Federal archaeologists established a research camp on the ranch, conducting careful excavations that revealed the treasure chamber was part of a much larger cave system containing additional artifact caches. Each discovery strengthened the site's protected status and made mining operations increasingly impossible. The media attention brought unexpected allies from across the country. Environmental organizations pledged funding for habitat restoration, while indigenous rights groups provided legal expertise for navigating repatriation processes. Elena found herself coordinating between disparate groups whose only common ground was protecting the mountain sanctuary from corporate exploitation. "You've become quite the diplomat," observed Rebecca Chen during one of her weekly legal consultations. The environmental lawyer had taken Elena's case pro bono after the story gained national attention, seeing it as a landmark opportunity to establish precedents for cultural preservation over mineral extraction. Elena laughed, gesturing at the organized chaos filling her grandmother's kitchen. Maps covered every surface, marking archaeological sites, habitat zones, and traditional hunting grounds. Phone calls came hourly from researchers, activists, and government officials seeking information or offering assistance. The quiet mountain retreat had transformed into headquarters for a conservation movement. "Grandmother always said this land had its own destiny," Elena replied, sorting through correspondence from tribal councils across the Southwest. "I'm just trying to help it fulfill that purpose." The repatriation process proved more complex than anyone anticipated. The artifacts represented multiple tribal groups whose territories had overlapped in the Mexican mountains, where Elena's ancestor had rescued them. Determining proper ownership required extensive genealogical research and cultural analysis, work that would take years to complete properly. Dr. Sarah Crow Feather had established a temporary office in the ranch's guest bedroom, coordinating with tribal historians to identify specific artifacts and their cultural significance. Her presence brought a sense of completion to Elena's mission. Finally, indigenous voices were directing the conversation about their own heritage. "Your ancestors. Documentation is remarkably detailed," Dr. Crowfeather explained during one of their evening consultations. She didn't just rescue these items. She interviewed tribal members about their significance, recorded oral histories, even learned traditional preservation techniques. This collection represents one of the most comprehensive archives of 19th century indigenous culture in existence. Elena felt profound gratitude for her ancestors' foresight and respect. The woman who'd fled Mexico with stolen treasure had become an anthropologist and cultural preservationist, ensuring that rescued artifacts would retain their spiritual and historical context. Her century-long mission had protected not just objects, but the knowledge needed to understand their true value. The legal proceedings against Apex Mining progressed with satisfying momentum. Corporate executives faced federal charges for destruction of archaeological sites, intimidation of witnesses, and conspiracy to violate indigenous cultural rights. Their aggressive tactics, once hidden from public scrutiny, now attracted congressional investigations and regulatory oversight. Castellanos is cooperating with prosecutors, Sheriff Martinez reported during his weekly security briefings, providing information about corporate strategies for acquiring mineral rights through intimidation and fraud. Looks like Apex has been pulling similar operations across the western states. Elena felt vindicated, but not vengeful. The corporate machine that had threatened her family's sanctuary was being dismantled by its own illegal actions. Justice served not through revenge, but through exposure of truth and protection of victims. The rebuilding of her cabin became a community project that surprised Elena with its scope and enthusiasm. Neighbors she'd barely met arrived with construction, materials, and labor, treating the reconstruction as investment in their collective future. The new structure incorporated traditional building techniques suggested by tribal consultants, creating a bridge between pioneer heritage and indigenous wisdom. Jake supervised the construction with obvious satisfaction, his carpentry skills enhanced by cultural insights from Dr. Crowfeather's research. "Building this way feels right," he observed, while installing hand-hewn timber supports. "Like we're finally working with the land instead of against it." Lucy planted an expanded herb garden around the new cabin, incorporating traditional healing plants that tribal members identified from historical records. The garden became a living laboratory where Elena studied the botanical knowledge her grandmother had begun teaching her in their Los Angeles apartment. "These mountains hold pharmacy knowledge that goes back thousands of years," Dr. Morse explained during one of their botanical walks. "Your grandmother understood that healing traditions connect us to the land in ways that modern medicine often ignores." Elena found herself becoming the unofficial liaison between scientific researchers and traditional knowledge holders, translating between academic language and spiritual understanding. The role felt natural, as if her bilingual childhood had prepared her for bridging cultural gaps in ways she'd never anticipated. The treasure chamber itself became a pilgrimage site for indigenous activists and environmental advocates from across North America. Elena established visitation protocols that respected both scientific research needs and spiritual practices, ensuring the sacred space remained protected while serving its educational mission. "This place changes people," observed James Running Bear, a tribal council member who traveled from Arizona to examine artifacts his ancestors had created. "Standing in that chamber, touching objects your great-grandmother made, feeling the connection across centuries, it transforms how you understand your place in the world." Elena witnessed those transformations daily as visitors experienced the profound connection between past and present that the treasure chamber represented. Politicians who'd supported mining interests changed their positions after seeing the cultural significance of what would have been destroyed. Corporate executives resigned rather than continue fighting battles they finally understood were morally indefensible. As winter melted into spring, Elena's new life settled into rhythms that honored both progress and tradition. Morning hours were devoted to correspondence with researchers and activists. Afternoons brought botanical studies with Dr. Morse and cultural education with Dr. Crowfeather. Evenings belonged to personal reflection and tending her grandmother's herb garden. The transformation of her daily existence paralleled changes in the broader landscape. Federal designation as a cultural preservation site brought funding for habitat restoration and archaeological research. The ranch became an educational center where students studied indigenous history, environmental conservation, and cultural preservation techniques. "You've created something unprecedented," Rebecca Chen observed during the spring legal review. "A successful model for community-based conservation that honors both cultural heritage and environmental protection. Law schools are already developing case studies based on your family's guardianship strategy." Elena felt humbled by the recognition while remaining focused on practical responsibilities. Legal victories meant nothing without ongoing stewardship, and stewardship required understanding connections between cultural preservation and ecological health that she was still learning to navigate. The anniversary of her arrival in the mountains brought reflection on changes that seemed impossible to measure in mere months. Elena stood in her rebuilt cabin, surrounded by photographs documenting the treasure discovery, legal proceedings, and community celebrations that had transformed her life from individual survival to collective mission. A knock on the door interrupted her contemplation. David stood on the porch, carrying a bottle of wine and wearing the satisfied expression of someone bearing good news. Behind him, Elena could see additional figures emerging from vehicles, faces she recognized from tribal councils, environmental organizations, and academic institutions. "Surprise celebration," David explained with obvious pleasure. "Everyone wanted to mark the anniversary of the day you completed Isabella's mission and started your own." The impromptu gathering filled Elena's cabin and spilled onto the porch, bringing together the diverse coalition that had formed around protecting the mountain sanctuary. Elena found herself moved by the genuine friendships that had developed, across cultural and professional boundaries, united by shared commitment to something larger than individual interests. Dr. Crowfeather offered a traditional blessing for the occasion, acknowledging the spirits of ancestors whose wisdom had guided their preservation efforts. Her words connected Elena's family story to broader narratives of resistance and protection that had sustained indigenous communities through centuries of cultural assault. "Your grandmother's spirit is here with us," Dr. Crowfeather concluded, gesturing toward the mountain peaks that glowed with sunset light. "She watches over this sacred place through your actions, through our collective commitment to honoring what she protected." As the celebration continued into the evening, Elena stepped outside to absorb the magnitude of what had been accomplished. The ranch that had offered her personal sanctuary had become a beacon for cultural preservation and environmental protection. Her individual escape from urban dangers had evolved into a community mission that would outlast any single generation. Jake joined her on the porch, carrying 2 mugs of Lucy's famous hot chocolate. "Thinking about what comes next?" he asked, settling into the chair that had become his customary spot during their evening conversations. Elena considered the question while watching fireflies begin their nightly dance among the healing herbs. "I think about sustainability. How to ensure this protection continues after we're gone. How to train the next generation of guardians." "Your grandmother would approve," Jake said with conviction. "She always thought beyond her own lifetime, planning protections that would outlast individual commitment." Elena nodded, understanding that her role as guardian was temporary stewardship. In a much longer story, future generations would face different challenges, requiring adaptive strategies while maintaining core commitments to cultural preservation and environmental protection. The celebration gradually wound down as guests departed for their various homes and hotels, leaving Eleanor with the peaceful satisfaction of well-served community. She walked through her cabin, straightening furniture and collecting dishes while reflecting on the evening's conversations about future possibilities. Tomorrow would bring new correspondence, fresh research findings, and ongoing negotiations with government agencies about expanding the preservation area. But tonight belonged to gratitude for the journey that had brought her from Los Angeles, desperation to mountain purpose, from individual survival to collective mission. As Elena prepared for sleep in the cabin her ancestors had built and rebuilt, she felt the profound peace that comes from aligning personal actions with historical purpose. Her grandmother's mission was complete, but Eleanor's own mission, protecting sacred places for future generations, would continue as long as mountains stood and communities remembered the connections between cultural heritage and environmental health. The mountains had indeed chosen their protector, just as Jake had predicted, and Elena had finally found not just sanctuary, but purpose that would sustain her for generations to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.